Well, I went walking after midnight, out in the moonlight, searching for you. And I went walking after midnight, out in the moonlight, searching for you.
This is at least the third project for this message this week that I've begun working on. For some reason, some weeks, it just doesn't feel right. You start down a certain path and it doesn't lead to where you sense that God is calling you to speak. And because of time, I actually decided, because I was struggling so much, that I was just going to pick a property and go for a walk with my Bible and the camera and allow God hopefully to show me a lesson that I need to hear, and hopefully one that's relevant for all of the church. So here you go. The property that I'm on today is a unique property in the fact that it starts off of a main route in Erie County, Pennsylvania. And there's a parking lot and then there's a trail that you can follow into the woods. And you think that you're going for a walk in the woods, and suddenly the landscape changes and you go from woods to wetter ground, and suddenly opening up before you is a swamp. And all of this takes place in just a couple hundred yards. But there are more surprises in store on this property as you continue to hike the trail. The loop part of the trail actually circles an area that has a lot of conifers, that's evergreen trees growing in it. And the amazing thing about this part of the property is that while it's now publicly owned, it originally was a private parcel, and a Christmas tree farm was operated from this very location that I'm in right now. If you look closely enough, you can actually see that there are all kinds of different evergreen species. You can actually see that the trees are lined up, at least the ones that were original, in perfectly straight rows. You can even see the furrows of where they plowed the soil up to make higher ground for the trees to grow along, and then the lower sculpted out ground between those rows. I even found evidence of a dead plow pan, which is a spot that's left after the plow goes through and there's not enough soil there to actually make it level. And I found some old fencing as well that was wrapped around a tree that's so old that this rusty old steel fence is actually breaking apart at places. I don't know the story of this property real well. I just know that there was a Christmas tree farm here at some point. I don't know exactly when it was in operation or who owned it, but I imagine if I go back in time to the moment when that family was able to realize the dream of a Christmas tree farm coming into existence, and the thrill of seeing families and young children come in to pick out their own Christmas tree and to be able to cut it down and take it home, a huge part of the Christmas season. And year after year, they would look forward to December when families would flock to this location to pick out the perfect tree for their family. At some point, the Christmas tree farm ceased to exist. And today, unless you actually know the inside story, or at least part of it, you would have no clue that there was a Christmas tree farm here. It's a nature preserve, if you will, a place to get away from it all, to actually hear the birds sing and watch the frogs jump and see the beavers swim and get away from the hustle and bustle of life. And this got me to thinking about how often life is like this very property. You start out in one direction thinking something is going to be, a dream that you have, something that God has placed on your heart, a desire that comes from deep within your bones. And then things change. Maybe time just passes and eventually we all die. Perhaps finances run thin or you feel called in a new direction. But life is certainly not a straight line. And this led me to the life of Paul. Most Christians are fairly well versed in the fact that Paul was a central figure in the early church, that he was known as the missionary to the Gentiles, even though he usually first started by preaching to the Jews in a location whenever he would go to a new city. He almost always, after speaking to the Jews, went out to the non-Jewish people and preached the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ to them. But what a lot of people don't spend a lot of time thinking about is where Paul came from. He grew up as a dual citizen, both as a Roman and also as a Jewish person. And so he was unique in that aspect. He probably knew many languages. I'm guessing at the very least, he knew Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and probably some other languages as well. But if you look at the early history of Paul's life, you would never guess that he would ultimately come to see Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, and definitely not go to the ends of the earth just about in that time to share this knowledge with other people, and certainly not guess that he would give his life because of this belief. In Philippians chapter 3, when Paul is actually arguing with the folks at Philippi, the church in Philippi, about making sure that they don't put their focus on their accomplishments, but on that of Jesus Christ. He actually tells some of his biography, some of his early life, and this is what he writes. If anyone else thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for legalistic righteousness, faultless. Essentially, we're given Paul's resume as he sees himself. And while from his early days this might look like a glowing resume, it stands in many ways in stark contrast to what he would ultimately become, a Christian missionary. He was circumcised on the 8th day, which was one of the most identifying features of the Jewish people for the males that were a part of that nation. He was schooled by the greatest teachers of the time. You notice that when Paul describes his life, he is somebody who is absolutely passionate and convinced about what his life is supposed to be about. He takes his belief in the Jewish God Yahweh, the one true God, so seriously that when Christianity comes on the scene, he actually persecutes Christians because he believes that they are not following the ways that God has outlined for their lives. He's willing to kill Christians. In Acts chapter 22, we get more of Paul's biography filled in for us. The scene is his arrest in Jerusalem. And Luke records for us more about who Paul was. It's part of Paul's defense before the judge. And this is what Paul said. Brothers and fathers, listen to my defense. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. Under Gamaliel, I was thoroughly trained in the law of our fathers and was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of the way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as also the high priest and all the council can testify. I even obtained letters from them to their brothers in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Paul goes on to describe this scene in Damascus and how Jesus reveals himself to Paul in that great vision and calls out to him. You might recall that story of Paul's life, that moment where his life is changed in an instant. And he goes blind and he's led to Ananias, who speaks into his life, and the rest is history, as they say. Paul becomes a fervent believer in Jesus Christ and gives his entire life, his very life itself, for Jesus Christ. Paul, perhaps the unlikeliest of Christian missionaries, actually gets the charge to be one of the most profound and influential missionaries for Jesus Christ in all of history to this very day. I know that's not what he thought his life would be about, and yet it's written in the pages of history and the Bible that that's who he became. A thought for you to ponder. Is it possible that you, today, as a believer in Jesus Christ, that in some way Paul actually influenced your conversion to know Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? And yet before he became that missionary, he was a zealous Jew who was trying to defend the veracity of the Jewish faith, Judaism. He couldn't understand how Jesus Christ could be the Messiah. But eventually he got it. He understood. And when he was convinced of it, nothing, not shipwrecks, not beatings, not arrests, not resistance from all sides could prevent him from telling the truth to people everywhere that he went. This is certainly a crazy time for the world, for our nation, for our local region. There are so many things that are going on that make this a historic moment. Many of you are without jobs, or at least in some way have had your hours cut back. The investments that you had perhaps in the stock market or your 401k have drastically changed over the last couple of months. You spent a considerable amount of time, most likely, cooped up in your home, and maybe still are. And that vision, that dream, that idea of what you thought your life was going to be about, maybe it's evaporated, maybe it's changed, maybe you realize now that it can't come to fruition, or at the very least, it's been delayed big time. Sometimes God leads me to share a cultural bit from the Jewish world that helps to unlock a passage. Other times, it's a specific word and a meaning that we don't necessarily understand because it's been translated from either Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek into English. Other times still, it's a distinct vantage point in which we don't understand the passage fully because we haven't been able to immerse ourselves in that passage long enough to really grasp its meaning. But this week, it's nothing new. It's stuff that you've probably heard before, but perhaps framed in a new way. This is a reminder. In Proverbs chapter 3, 5 and 6, it says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." Notice it says paths, not path. That there are diversions that take place in all of our lives. Now, I'm not here to suggest that God wanted the coronavirus to take place, or that there would be the upheaval in our country that is currently going on, or that there are divisions between people, even within families, about really hot button issues, politically speaking, and socially speaking, and morally speaking. And yet again, maybe this is the catalyst that God is using to bring about change and to direct the paths in your life and in mine. I'm usually not accused of being a person who is succinct, but I challenge you this week, this moment, today, to take some time to ponder the meaning of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Where does God have you right now? What is He positioning you to do? Are you investing your time enough in your relationship with Him that you're going to be prepared for whatever the next step is? Just like this property, things aren't always as they appear when you first start out. They change over time. And could it be that God is doing something brand new in your life, preparing you for this moment to carry out His purpose in a big way? God bless you as you endeavor to listen to Him and be obedient to His way.
I went walking after midnight, out in the moonlight, searching for you. And I went walking after midnight, searching for you. I said, I went walking, and looking for you.
In fact, in Acts chapter 26, we get a little bit more of Paul's biography described for us. If nothing else, this property is abundant in at least 3 things. If nothing else, this property is abundant in at least 3 things: conifer trees, poison ivy, and mosquitoes. Lots and lots of mosquitoes.